Every car you've ever driven, every car you've ever been in, every car you've ever seen drive down the road or around a racetrack has had one thing in common. They've all been propelled by the rotation of the wheels. Every one of those cars has a power plant inside that rotates a shaft, which turns the wheels and propels the car forward. There is the occasional museum curiosity or daredevil sideshow, but virtually all cars are wheel-driven. The smallest, the tallest, the longest, the ugliest, all the same propulsion. But not the fastest. The fastest car ever is the Thrust SSC. In October of 1997, the Thrust SSC, piloted by Andy Green, went 763 miles per hour over the Black Rock Desert in Nevada. It is the only car to have ever broken the sound barrier. It has 2 jet engines blasting thrust out the back. It has solid aluminum wheels. It has a cockpit. It was piloted by a Royal Air Force fighter pilot. But is it a car? Is it actually a car? Is this a car? What about this one? If this is a car, then does that mean that this is a boat? If an airplane never takes off, maybe it's not a car. A bird with clipped wings is not a mongoose, it's just a lame bird. This is super cool. It's an amazing accomplishment, an inspiring feat of engineering, but you could pretty easily argue that it's not really a car. And if the fastest car in the world is not really a car, then what is the fastest car in the world? This car has 4 wheels. It has air-filled rubber tires. It has a steering wheel and a brake pedal and an accelerator pedal and a guy inside driving it. It has an internal combustion engine that rotates a shaft that is connected to the wheels. And it is the only car in the history of cars that has gone 500 miles per hour, the same way as every other actual car, by propelling itself forward with the wheels. The name Vesco has dotted land speed racing record books for almost as long as there have been record books. John Vesco was racing on Muroc Dry Lake in Southern California in the 1930s before it became a runway extension for Edwards Air Force Base. His sons, Don and Rick, were racing when they were in high school, building all sorts of wheel-driven contraptions and embarrassing racers at drag strips and dry lakes across the western United States. The brothers had the fastest motorcycle in the world for a time. It was the first motorcycle to go 250 miles per hour, and later the first to reach 300 miles per hour, propelled by 2 Yamaha 750 engines connected with belts at the crankshaft. Their dad, John, built the Little Giant in the early 1950s, the narrowest streamliner at the time. Originally powered by a Ford Model A engine, this car was recently upgraded to dual electric motors and is currently the fastest electric vehicle in the world. I did a whole video about this you should check out if you haven't seen it yet. I'll put a link at the end of this video. In 1981, a mechanical failure caused that car to lose control, and Rick ended up sliding through the timing lights upside down at 300 miles per hour.
I knew I was over 300. I was right in the traps, and the right rear tire blew. And that son of a gun went right upside down, just did one of these barrel rolls like this, but it was still going straight, and it slid right down the course, went through the 5 mile, and that's what that trophy's for, 300.300.
Shortly after that near-death experience, he decided, like any reasonable person, that he needed to go faster. A lot faster. And soon, because the salt flats are disappearing. When people first started racing out here, the salt thickness could be measured in feet. Now it's inches, sometimes less. In a few years, it might not be suitable for racing at all. Salt flats racing is a moment in time. Rick Vesco saw this coming years ago, and he wanted to build a car that would be the first to drive 500 miles per hour without the use of jets or rockets. And he wanted to do it before the salt was gone. So in 1981, Rick started sketching up the car, giving it a wider front track and a narrower rear track to ensure that the rear tires would see fresh salt undisturbed by the fronts. He made a few models to show potential sponsors and supporters. At the time, the wheel-driven land speed record was just over 409 miles per hour. It was held by Goldenrod, a streamliner powered by 4 Chrysler Hemi engines mounted in line, giving a total power output of 2,400 horsepower. Rick named the car Project 425, aiming for 425 miles per hour. He teamed up with Dave Spangler, the president of Hooker Headers, to raise sponsorship for the project. Rick's brother Don was busy trying to go 400 miles per hour in a modified version of that motorcycle they had built, but a high-speed crash ended that project. Don had only minor injuries, but the vehicle was done for. So Don joined his brother on Project 425. The car was originally conceived with a pretty standard powertrain, or standard for land speed racing anyway. It started life with 2 Chevy engines, just regular naturally aspirated carbureted engines. But the team lost the sponsorship they had for those engines when somebody in the sponsoring company embezzled $3 million. After that, it got real race car engines, 2 turbocharged Offenhauser engines, sometimes called Offies. These engines dominated open-wheel racing in the US for decades and made a lot of power.
They put out about 1,000 apiece when you got the big turbos on them. They're little 159 cubic inches, but they were mean.
Unfortunately, as most racers know, a lot of power does not mean a lot of reliability.
The offie thing broke right away. I mean, we got up to 397, I think. Anyway, it dropped an intake valve, and he had a shared plenum chamber thing on it, and it killed both motors, and we couldn't find parts.
425 miles per hour was going to take a lot of power, partly because the car needs to be able to accelerate. Land racing is not drag racing, unless you're trying to go 425 miles per hour, and then it's kind of drag racing. There are only 4 or 5 miles to get up to speed, and even less to slow down. The total length changes sometimes depending on the quality of the salt, but if you're looking for serious speed, you need to get up to that speed as quickly as possible. The answer came when Rick's brother Don went down to San Diego for a boat race and saw the turbine-powered boats making insanely fast passes.
Don calls me and says, "These boats are going 200 in the no-wake zone, man." He says, "We got to get an engine." And somehow, some way, it was a T55 engine we ended up with, yellow-tagged engine. It wasn't blown up. It fit in that frame. That's a perimeter frame. 83 thousandths ended up be the clearance between the burner can and the drive shaft to the rear-wheel drive. I mean, it was like it was made for it.
This is a military surplus engine originally from a Chinook helicopter, and yes, it is a turbine engine, which is similar to those cars that I was just saying were not actual cars. But here's the difference. Those are jet engines. They make power by ejecting gases out the back at very high speeds. The wheels are just along for the ride. The turbo shaft engine in this race car actually rotates the wheels. I'll get into more details in a moment, but to the point, cars, actual cars I mean, have lots of different types of engines. Gas, diesel, electric, hybrid, hydrogen, steam cars were a popular thing for a while. The thing that all these cars have in common is the wheel-driven part. You might even remember that Chrysler made a handful of turbine cars for testing. Those are the same type of turboshaft as the Turbinator. After the engine was acquired, the car was modified slightly to mount the new engine. A gearbox and drive shafts were adapted to get the power to the wheels, and they took it out to the salt flats for its first run on a cold testing day. And they encountered one minor problem.
We got out there, we lit it off for the first time. The wheels were going backwards.
Most piston engines in cars rotate clockwise, some counterclockwise, but the important thing when talking about a car engine rotation is that you are looking at it from the front. The rotation of aircraft engines is always talked about from the pilot's perspective. There was a fix for this, but the team would have to rebuild a large part of the car to make it happen.
Don and I go into town. We found a garage. He let us stay up all night. It was 3 in the morning and snow was blowing under the door of this guy's place. We flipped, luckily the front and rear are industrial gearbox, and you could flip them over.
The next day, with the wheels rotating in the correct direction and on its first outing as a turbine-powered car, it went just under 300 miles per hour. Pretty soon after that, at one of the car's first events, it went fast enough to break the record, going 437 miles per hour. But it's not a record unless you back it up with a return run, and the return run had problems.
There was so much salt spray coming off the front tires, it ate 2 slots down the car and salt got in the engine and it backfired a compressor stall. Boom, boom, boom. I heard it. It was pretty ugly. Yeah, we darn near had the record. It was like, holy shit, this thing's going to do it.
For the next few years, the team took the car out, setting blazing fast speeds, but never quite going fast enough with a return run to set the record. And then, in October of 2001, Don Vesco, driving the Turbinator, set the all-out wheel-driven land speed record at 458 miles per hour. That was the average speed over a mile. The actual top speed of the car was 470. And then, it wasn't. Zeus fasteners are these flathead aerodynamic quarter-turn fasteners you see on race cars a lot. The Turbinator has several of them, and at some point, one of them made its way into the turbine engine. This is not good. This is expensive. This happened at 461 miles per hour. The turbine exploded parts in all directions. They found engine parts in the nose of the car. They had met their goal, the fastest wheel-driven car in the world. But the Turbinator 1 would never drive again. Wait, why is it called Turbinator 1? If you're like me, it's been a few years since you stumbled your way into a C+ in thermodynamics class, so let's go over an engine cycle refresher. A typical internal combustion engine generates power by igniting fuel and oxygen in a combustion chamber. The pressure created pushes a piston down. That piston rotates a crankshaft, and that crankshaft rotates the wheels. A turbine engine also has a combustion chamber where the air and fuel ignite and expand. This expansion makes its way out the exhaust and spins up these turbines while doing so. These turbines are connected by a shaft to these compressors up front. So the spinning of the turbine blades at the exhaust creates power that's used to spin the compressors up front. These feed fresh air into the combustion chamber. While piston engines have discrete steps of intake, compression, ignition, and exhaust, a turbine engine is doing all of them all the time. While a piston engine makes crankshaft power, the power created by a turbine engine goes to two places. Part of it goes into the shaft to help compress the incoming air, and part of it goes out the back as thrust. Here's the cool thing. You can change the size or number of fans on either side to change the balance of power. A turbojet gets maximum thrust. The only power that goes into the shaft is what's needed to compress the fresh air and run a few things like fuel and oil pumps. But if you wanted to, you could add lots of turbines at the rear to suck out most of the energy. You'd have way less thrust, but a ton of power going into the shaft. Then you stick a big propeller on the front and fly around like a regular propeller plane. This is a turboprop. Modern airliners are kind of a hybrid of the two. Most of the power is shaft power used to rotate a large fan up front. This is just an extra fancy propeller, and it just moves air like a regular propeller, only more efficiently at higher speeds. This is called a turbofan engine, and about 70% of the thrust comes from the fan, with the extra 30% coming from the thrust of the jet part of the engine. The thrust SSC used a low bypass turbofan, where most of the thrust comes from the hot gases and a little from the fan air going around the combustion chamber. So you have a spectrum of turbine engines, from full jet making almost no shaft power and all jet thrust, a turbofan in the middle making mostly shaft power, and at the other side a turboprop that sucks up all the exhaust energy to run a shaft connected to a propeller. But there is another kind of turbine engine called a turboshaft. If you take that turboprop engine and remove the propeller, you now have a relatively small engine making a tremendous amount of shaft horsepower. Sometimes people will call a turboshaft engine a jet engine, but it's not really. It's not a reaction engine. You'll often see turboshaft engines connected to electrical generators, sometimes on airplanes and larger boats as a way to generate electricity. A lot of helicopters use what's called a free turbine turboshaft. This is what the Turbinator uses. It works like any other turbine engine with the compressors and turbines connected by a shaft, but there is an extra section called the power turbine. This section has its own shaft. It's not connected to any of the rest of the engine. It rotates because it has all that hot exhaust gas blowing by it, causing it to spin. It sucks out all that energy from the exhaust and turns it into shaft power. Think of it as a windmill, but instead of just using whatever wind comes by, you make your own wind with the jet engine. This is great for helicopters because it decouples the rotation of the turbine part of the engine from the blades that do the lifting. This is also nice for a car where the decoupled power shaft essentially acts like a torque converter. This is why this car doesn't need a clutch or a torque converter. You can run the engine without turning the shaft. You do have to stand on the brakes. It makes about 250 horsepower at idle. The Turbinator engine does create some thrust, about 300 pounds per square inch, but it's more of a nuisance than anything. It's not enough to even move the car when it's standing still, but it does mess with the airflow around the car. Almost all of the power, about 5,000 horsepower, goes into the shaft. The shaft in this engine actually goes through the center of the turbine and out the front. The shaft is connected to the wheels with a series of gears, belts, and U-joints. The main gear reduction happens at the front of the engine with 3 massive gears. This whole assembly here houses the main gears, which reduce the RPM and bring the rotational power to the side of the engine, splitting it in the front and rear with a U-joint on either side. From there, the drive shafts go to the front and back, where power is then transferred back to the vehicle centerline with the biggest Gates belts you've ever seen. These make top fuel supercharger belts look like fan belts. From there, the power is split to the 2 wheels through a right-angle gearbox. This is just an industrial gearbox originally designed for 50 horsepower. It has been upgraded considerably with aluminum reinforcements. The wheels are custom built to fit the gearbox, the hubs, and the massive carbon Kevlar disc brakes. The power is sent to the ground with tires, originally Mickey Thompson, but more recently Goodyear Land Speed tires. You get 1 run in these tires, sometimes less. The thing about race cars is that they're never really finished. There's always something that wasn't right, something that needs to be improved. They can always be made just a little bit faster. In 2002, Don Vesco passed away from cancer. He would never realize his goal of being the first person in a wheel-driven car over 500 miles per hour. But Team Vesco would carry on. In 2001, when Don set the wheel-driven record, the car was still accelerating as it passed the timing lights at 470 miles per hour. With some improvements, it could go faster, and maybe it could go 500 miles per hour. There were a few obvious changes to be made. The car was geared a little too fast, limiting the acceleration at low speeds, so new gears were made. The inlet of the engine was narrow, not only choking the engine, but also causing it to run too hot. Don had to ease off the throttle several times during his record run to keep the exhaust gas temperatures from burning up the turbine. Also, the car was generating lift in the front and downforce in the rear, pitching the nose of the car up. This is bad. If it gets too much air underneath it, it could get airborne, and helicopter engine or not, it is not designed to fly. So Rick extended the nose of the car forward by 16 inches, extended the rear by another 16 inches, and lengthened the engine bay by 28 inches. He also split the exhaust out on two sides. Originally, they had a single outlet on the top, but it was too small, so they had this rooster tail of hot gas that was messing with the aerodynamics and creating a higher than ideal exhaust gas temperature. They also added some sheet metal fins in the outlet to straighten out the exhaust. The first time they ran the car, it blasted the paint off of one side, but the other side was untouched. Heat shielding was added to cover the burnt paint. A third parachute was added to help slow the car down, because when you're going this fast, a big part of land speed racing is just slowing down. The car frame was the same, although modified significantly. It had a new engine, a new body, a new parachute system, new steering, brakes, wheels, tires, and a new goal. This was Project 500. The goal was to be the first wheel-driven car to go 500 miles per hour, and the upgraded car was called Turbinator II. Turbinator II made its first run on the Salt in 2013, getting up to 250 miles per hour in a test run. 2 years later, the car completed 5 test runs and reached 350 miles per hour. Unfortunately, the rough race course caused the parachute to deploy early on more than one run. In that same year, at World Finals a couple of months later, the car reached 400 miles per hour just in time for the rear drive shaft to break, instantly sending all the power to the front wheels.
All the power went to the front, and then it broke a U-joint up there. It went into orbit and took the right front tire out.
Somehow, the driver, David Spangler, kept the rubber side down and steered the car off course on 3 wheels. The car didn't roll or tumble down the Salt, but the damage was still significant. But a year later, the car was back together with fixed bodywork and a new paint job. To test the new drive shaft, the driver did a 4-wheel burnout at the start line. Later on in the event, the car went over 430 miles per hour in 3 separate runs. They would have set a new higher record, except the timing lights didn't work on the return run, but the car ran great and they were confident that 500 miles per hour was just around the corner. Speed Week is an event held at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah every year since 1949. Don and Rick Vesco's father was one of the first racers there that year. 70 years later, the Turbinator set the fastest mile time ever recorded at Speed Week, averaging 463 miles per hour, the fastest record at 455, and the fastest exit speed at over 470 miles per hour. The goal of Turbinator II wasn't really a record, it was just getting up to 500 miles per hour. They didn't make it at Speed Week, but there are 2 other events later in the year. At the World of Speed event in September, the team returned and broke its own record, setting a new record of over 482 miles per hour. The top speed was 492, just barely shy of 500. 2 weeks later, in October, at the World Finals event, Turbinator II made only 1 run. By the end of mile 2, it was traveling over 370 miles per hour. The average speed over the 3rd mile was 400. 4th mile average was 459. The average speed over the last mile was 493, with an exit speed of 503 miles per hour. It was the fastest wheel-driven car, the fastest car using actual tires instead of solid chunks of aluminum, the fastest car at every event that year, and the first and still only car that has ever exceeded 500 miles per hour without a rocket or a jet engine. 37 years after Rick conceived what was originally called Project 425, he had just made history again. The engine in your car uses a computer called an ECU, or engine control unit, to know when and how much fuel to inject. Turbine engines have a similar system called a FADEC, or a Full Authority Digital Engine Control. The difference is the full authority part. The driver doesn't operate a throttle or a choke, he just asks for a specific amount of thrust, and the FADEC looks at all the sensors and decides how to make that happen. Actually, modern drive-by-wire car systems do this too, so you can just start calling the ECU and related sensors in your car a FADEC system. If anyone asks, tell them a YouTuber said it was okay. The engine in your piston engine car wants to be screaming at full tilt at all times. It wants to spit out the maximum power and spin itself up continuously until it explodes. It yearns for chaos. But this chaos is kept in check with the throttle, a little rotating plate that limits the amount of air your engine can suck in, and therefore the amount of power it can make. A turbine engine does not have a throttle. It is continually sucking in as much air as it can, so the engine is held in check by limiting fuel. When you want more power, you press the accelerator, and the FADEC decides how to make that happen. The ambient pressure, compressor section temperature, the engine RPM, and a handful of other sensors are read by the computer. It decides based on all that data to add a specific amount of extra fuel to the combustion chamber. This causes more combustion, which accelerates the turbine and compressor section, which pulls in more air until you reach a steady state equilibrium again. Modern turbine engines use computers for all of this, but the older T55 uses a lot of mechanical control. The fuel controller has gears and bellows to mechanically calculate fuel flow based on the speeds of the gas turbine, called N1, and the power turbine, called N2. Controlling all of this is difficult, both in tuning the engine and also just driving the thing. Even though it's all in a straight line, driving this car takes so much focus and concentration that the driver, David Spangler, has a hard time answering one of the most common questions he gets. What does it feel like to drive that fast?
I'm concentrating so hard that the idea that, wow, this is fast, and I don't do any of that. I just worry about the car, what it's doing, what feedback it's giving me, and I really don't know what it feels like. I know things are coming by pretty fast. That's about all I can tell you.
An official land speed record is the average of two averages. The Turbinator went 503 miles per hour, but the average speed over the flying mile was 493. So the next day, on the return run, if they had an average speed faster than 507, then they would have the first ever wheel-driven record above 500 miles per hour. Looking at the data, they knew they could accelerate faster and get up to a higher speed, and they knew they could get 2 more degrees out of the exhaust gas temperature, which should give them 515 miles per hour. They went back to the hotel, got some sleep, and returned in the morning to a shallow lake. Rain had ruined their plans. They returned the following year in 2019 and went 89 miles per hour. That was their top speed. They didn't actually change anything from the previous year, it just kind of stopped working. Something happened and they couldn't get it working at the event. So they took it to an engine dyno, an actual turbine engine dyno, and the engine burned itself up. It had to be rebuilt. They got it done just in time to be the very last run at the last event in 2021. The team doesn't like to do test runs. They like to go full beans or nothing at all. But with the problems they had on the dyno, they agreed to a 3-mile test run. After the first timed mile, they were 23 miles per hour faster than their fastest ever first mile. At 2 1/4, they were at 397.
We were almost 400 miles an hour, which is just incredible. And we exited the 3-mile run at roughly 421. We're 80 miles an hour from 500 miles an hour at that point. So we were pretty darn excited. We thought, well, we're just going to come back. At 2 runs, we'll have a 500-mile-an-hour record.
But rain would once again foil their plans. The 2022 event was canceled. The following year, it was basically rained out. There was only a short course, not nearly long enough to get up to 500, and definitely too soggy. This was the year that I ran, and it was slippery. Pretty sketchy at 150, probably not great at 500. So the team wisely skipped this year too. They returned in 2024 with a tested engine and new Goodyear tires, and they ran into a handful of problems. The first run made it only a few feet before the driver noticed a change that needed to be made. They went back out and made it about 1/3 of 1 mile before a loud noise led to an abort. The loud noise, they found out later, was a failure of one of the driveshaft cross shafts. The U-joints are Dana Spicer 1350 U-joints. These are typical race car U-joints, but the yokes for this car are custom made to be stronger. When the cross shaft broke, the yokes were still touching each other and transmitting power, so they didn't know that a cross shaft was broken. So they went back out and raced a few more times, unknowingly with a broken rear driveshaft. Eventually, the 2 yokes came loose, instantly sending all the power to the front wheels, which totally cooked the tires. And that was the last run of the Turbinator. The car is going into retirement. Rick has decided to focus his time on getting the little giant back to being powered by the old engine that his dad had originally built for it. The short test run in 2021 exceeded their previous top speed by 20 miles per hour in every part of the course. There is a lot of potential left in this car. But as every racer knows, the difference between potential and reality is a lot of luck and years of work, especially in land speed racing where you get only a handful of runs each year. Maybe. What was originally called Project 425 has met and well exceeded its original goal of 425 miles per hour. Don Vesco shattered that record, becoming the fastest person in the world, propelled by wheels and tires. 17 years later, David Spangler became the first person to ever drive a car past 500 miles per hour without the help of a jet or a rocket. The Turbinator was and will forever be the first wheel-driven car past 500 miles per hour, and for the time being, still the fastest wheel-driven car ever. And for those of us who look at a jet-powered car with a cockpit and a pilot and think, that's cool, but that's not really a car, then this is the fastest car in the world. Used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show, but now all you have to do is impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. It actually helps the channel a lot. And of course, all hail the algorithm.